In this episode, I'm going to show how you can control and change and adjust your lighting in post-processing using a few different techniques. We're going to be going old school on this, and I'm going to show why sometimes this works better. We're going to be using two different images. We're going to be taking a look at the sunset shot, and we're really going to pump that up. And also we're going to take a look at a very common, very dark kitchen that you can come across and how we can adjust that to make that look a lot better. Now, these are going to be using some old school techniques. We're going to be using dodge, burn, and sponge. And these are tools that are very often overlooked in post-processing. And when they are applied, they're often done incorrectly. I'm going to show how to do it accurate, fast, and non-destructively. So let's get started. So here's that sunset picture, and it does look fairly good compared to what we started with. This was just one of the exposures taken that evening to get this particular shot. And you can see I edited out a GoPro, had some really cool sunset footage that came off of that. But besides that, obviously there was a sky replacement, a few other things. You can see there's a lot of layers involved here, but even when we got to this finished state, it's still lacking a little bit of punch. So a little bit of editing to control some of the lighting will really help this. And it's not a matter of using brushes. We can do a much better job in this particular case using dodge, burn, and sponge. So to get to some of the basics though, before we get into editing this one, let's take a look at a very common example, and that's this particular kitchen. Now this, when it started out, looked like this. This was just an ambient shot, and this is what I call light disparity, where you have a lot of light in one area of the room and almost none at the other end. Now this of course makes HDR very difficult, but this wasn't done using HDR. This used the flambient technique. So I did a flambient shot here where I did a two-sided composite, edited myself out. I added then some ambient luminance, did some color corrections, then got rid of the reflection here with a partial darken mode window pull, and applied my post-processing preset. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this, this is stuff that I cover in my Pro Interiors course, and I have a link to that down in the description of this video, along with my books and other training material that can help you out to learn these techniques. But now that we're to this point right here, we really could stand to have a little bit more lighting here. Yes, this is better than what it was, but once again, that was taken care of with Flash. So this could be a deliverable product to the customer, but we can do a much better job very simply by adding some dodge and burn. Now, you might think of using some brushes, which you can do in Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom Classic, but this old school technique that I'm going to show you really works well. The first thing you want to do is you don't want to edit this particular layer. What you want to do is add a new gray layer. This is how it's done. What you do is you go up to Layer, New, and then Layer. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this one DB for Dodge and Burn. And then what I'm going to do is change its mode from Normal to Overlay. When I do that, it gives me an option here to fill with overlay neutral color. So I'll just click this checkbox, and when I'm done, I click OK. Now, nothing's changed so far, but what I have here is this new layer. You can see it's in overlay mode, and it doesn't seem to be doing anything yet. What we're going to do now is we're going to be doing dodging and burning on this layer, and then later we're going to do some stuff with sponge as well. And then we'll get to that other shot with the sunset to apply these techniques. But here you can see it's very dull looking over here by the sink. So what I'd like to do is use the dodge tool. If you go over here and you hold this down, you'll see there's dodge, burn, and sponge. Let's start though with dodge. This allows us to lighten an area. So I'll just increase this. It's just a brush, just like you would have any other type of brush tool. So over here, this is where all the typical size, hardness, things like that are controlled. So nothing different. What we're able to do though with this tool, not just with dodge, but also with the burn tool, is we can select what part of the tonal range we want to work with. Most of the time, midtones will work best. We're going to be using different ones though when we get to that sunset shot. So let's just stay with the midtones and let's set our exposure to 20. What that means is that as I start brushing along in here, then it will apply that exposure. And so I'm just going to brush very lightly here. And it's like painting a little bit. So you can see I'm just painting in a little bit of that brightness. Now, if I turn that layer off, you can see this is what it was before, this is what it was after. So I can decide to then add just a little bit of lightness here. And maybe I want even more up here under that light. So I click a little bit more right there. So that's looking pretty good. Now out here too, by the way, this went to a dark patio. It was almost black out there. So because of this, that's why that window looks dark to the outside. Very little bit of an odd design. But anyways, we can then lighten up these areas that we feel we need to. And by just turning that layer on and off, we can then see the differences. Now, if things were too bright, like over here where this counter is near the camera, then what I can do is do a burn. So what I would do is select the burn tool. With the burn tool, once again, I can decide where I want to work. In this case, we'll select the midtones. Keep the exposure at about 20%, and then I can just do a simple burn right here. I'm brushing right here, and you can see that's starting to darken that area of the countertop. As long as I keep going and lifting my mouse and clicking again, it changes it and changes it and changes it. So this is with it, this is without it. Now, if I went too much with this, then what I can do is I can put a layer mask on this. I can go up to Layer, Layer Mask, and then Reveal All. And then I can take an eraser tool, and let's say 30% flow, and I can erase off this layer because it's non-destructive. I'm using this layer here, this gray layer, to do all of my dodging and burning. Similarly too, I can also go over to this layer and keep changing the dodge and burn on the various areas. Okay, so that's how dodge and burn work from its basis. We're going to apply that to that sunset shot. But first, you can see what's happening here by lightening this. We have a lot of saturation on this old red valance. So what we want to do is use the sponge tool. Now there are other ways that you can do this with different saturation techniques and using color cast techniques like I've shown before. But here using the sponge tool, what I've done is I've made a duplicate copy of the layers. What I've done is it's right here. And all that is just all the layers that were before it. And you can see then if I click that back on to see all layers, there's our dodge and burn. So anyways, on this layer, not the dodge and burn gray layer, but on this layer, which is a duplicate of the other layers, what I can do now is use the sponge tool. So go back over here and we'll select the sponge tool. Now there's two options to either desaturate or you can saturate. What I'll do is we want this at desaturate. And once again, the flow will be 20%. And what's unique about this is that I can select to have vibrance selected. And what that does is vibrance, like all vibrance adjustments, whether it's in Lightroom Classic or Adobe Camera Raw, whatever, vibrance is different from saturation. Instead of saturating all colors, vibrance concentrates on muted colors. So by desaturating what would have normally been muted colors but were enhanced very high, it allows us to even this out a little bit more. Instead of just desaturating the reds, we're going to desaturate the colors that were originally muted and should be. So now I'm just going to use that sponge tool and go over this area. I'm also going to go up here onto the wall. You can see because there was some color cast there. Now let's take a look at before and after by just turning this layer off, and then I'll turn it on. Once again, this is with that adjustment using sponge, and this is with it off. So anyways, with sponge, you see we now have a lot more control. So this is what our image looked like before dodge, burn, and sponge, and this is now what we have. And once again, this is to your liking, and you have these non-destructive layers that you can work with. Now let's take a look at applying this to the sunset shot. Now, this was, once again, a lot of layers that were involved here. You can see I even started with blocking out some of the sun flares, which were showing up in some of these images. You can see right there. And this was taken with a lot of layers, and this is exactly what I show in my course on doing pro exterior photography. And there's also then a link to that down in the description as well. But here, after doing the sky swap, and yes, I do have a pretty good even exposure looking here. It's probably a deliverable photo, but it still lacks a little bit of punch. I don't want to saturate everything. I don't want to darken everything. I just want to use the dodge, burn, and sponge tool in certain areas to really pump this up. But either way, this is what it looked like before. This is just one of the exposures. This is what we have right now, but we're going to do better. So at the very top of this layer, which by the way is just a duplicate layer of finally doing my post-processing presets so that I can use the sponge tool here, we're first going to use dodge and burn. So once again, we'll make that gray layer. We'll go up to Layer, New Layer, and we'll call this one DB for dodge and burn. We're going to set its mode to overlay. We're going to click fill with overlay neutral 50% gray. So now we've got our gray layer called DB. Now what I'd like to do is this railing here turned out to be extremely bright because it was white plastic. So that white vinyl that they have for these safety railings. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our burn tool. And with the burn tool, I'm going to first work on the highlights. And with the highlights selected, exposure at 20%, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to just brush a little bit, just real softly here, to see how this works on downing those highlights. Once again, I can turn the layer off and on and see how that goes. So it's a very subtle change, but adding just a little bit of punch. A lot of highlights right here, which can be real distracting near the camera, so we'll brush those out as well. Might even be able to do a little bit over the water right there. Let's see if that works. It's okay. So anyways, we did tone down a lot of those highlights, and now I can also take those and down the midtones. So I can take the midtones and then also burn those just a little bit in some of those distracting areas. And so you can see this was before the midtones, this is after. Very subtle change. But another thing too is it's very bright in some areas, especially across this portion of the sky. I think it would look a lot better if we just darken this a little bit. So what I'm going to do is keep it in the midtones. I'm going to take the brush size of this burn tool, very large, and just very lightly brush in there. So all I did, you can see, very light adjustment right there. Now I'd also like to highlight a few of these houses. There's one that's over here, a mansion over here, and a mansion over here. So what I'd like to do now is take my dodge tool, and I'm going to keep that at the midtones, 20%, and I'm going to just brighten those up just a little bit right there. Now, if the shadows also are a little low, like on this mountain over here, then I can work in just the shadows portion of the tonal range and lighten those shadows up. So you can see this was then before we did all our dodging. This is what it looks like after we did our dodging. So I can do some other stuff too, maybe burn just a little bit of the top of these mountains where it faded into here, give a little bit more drama to the lights that were coming in, these flares off of here, and then also maybe just darken this over here where we don't need this distracting, weedy looking bush compared to this $10 million view of this lake. So now we have this. So let's take a look at what this did with those simple adjustments. If we turn this layer off, this is what we had. If we turn it back on, we've got something that's definitely more punchy. Now, this is all to your liking, to your taste, what you'd like to do with it. But the next thing is to then work with our sponge tool to change some of the saturation. And after doing that, then it can also change some of the lighting. That's why I usually work together under this same tool set, dodge, burn, and sponge, because as you change saturation, you're working in hue, saturation, and brightness, also known as the HSB model. And when you do that, color can change the perception of its luminance. So let's change some of the saturation. So first thing with the sponge tool, I'm going to use a desaturation on this railing. It's just way too much. So I'm going to go down here to this duplicate layer that I have here. That's what this is. And I'm just going to lightly desaturate some of this around here. It's just so neon looking, so distracting. So we'll just take some of that saturation out of there. Now, you could use other methods to do this, but with all just in one little area here, sometimes this is easier. So you can see this is with it. that's before. So definitely an improvement. But now what I'd like to do is, remember, we darkened this area over here by using the burn tool. What I'd like to do is add a little more saturation vibrance to that by using the sponge tool in saturation mode. So I'm going to change it from desaturate to saturate. We'll keep the flow at 20%. And I'm going to go fairly large on this brush too, so that we can get a good overlap. And I'm going to real lightly just brush there a little bit, brush there a little bit. And you can see each time I do, small changes are being made. And then I can turn this on and off and see how that's being affected. This was before I started adding saturation there. And in the history, if I go here, that's with that saturation. The same thing here, if we add just a little bit of vibrance up here in the corners where these dramatic clouds are, it really helps frame the sunset. And I'll do that over here as well. So you can see then without that, it would be like this. And with that, this is what we have. Now, some of this may have gone too far. And if it does, and you don't like it, you can change the layer opacity down just a little bit to where you like what you're seeing. So once again, this is where we started. And then after we did some dodge and burn, we've got this little bit more impactful image. And then after we use the sponge tool, we have this image.